It is so good to see everybody here today. I very much appreciate your presence. If we have any visitors among us, I encourage you to fill out a visitor's card at the end of our worship service. A few of our members will go around and collect those. We simply want to get in contact with you and find out if you have a spiritual need of any kind. If you'd like to study with us, if you'd like to ask questions about our congregation, or if you would like to know more about the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is the good news that salvation is free to all who will come to God on His terms. We would love to sit down and have those kinds of conversations with you. I want to talk about apples for just a moment before we get into our lesson. Braeburn, Golden Delicious, Gala, Granny Smith, Fuji, Honeycrisp, Macintosh, John O'Gold, Red Delicious. Were one of those your favorite apple? Maybe you like all of them. Maybe you're just kind of non-discriminatory when it comes to apples, and anything is okay with you. If you're like me, maybe you prefer pears. I'm a pear guy myself, personally. But if I was going to have an apple, and I like apples just fine, I like Red Delicious. I like Red Delicious. They're not sour, they're sweet, they're easy to bite into. When you get into those yellow and green apples, they're just too sour for me. Can't stand them. Can't stand them. I know they're good in a baked pie or something like that, but I'm not a green or yellow apple kind of guy. I like a Red Delicious apple. Nice, juicy, sweet, Red Delicious. But maybe you do like a different kind of apple, and you like the more sour apples, so that's just your preference. Maybe you like those that are a mix of both, yellow, green, and red, and depending on the one that you find, it can be a nice symphony of colors and flavors inside of it. See, that was really a nice picture I painted for you there. But whatever your favorite kind of apple is, it's still an apple. Maybe you'd prefer an apple to be one way or another, and certainly every kind of apple has something about it that makes it unique, whether it's the color or the thickness of the peel, or whether it's sweet or it's sour, large or small, good for baking or not good for baking. It's still an apple, though. It's still an apple, even if it's not your favorite apple. It's still an apple. Now, I'm going to shift gears pretty severely here, so let's listen to the gears grind here. I'd like to talk about our elder selection process that we've been going through lately. I'm very impressed, by the way, with the congregation as we're nearing the end of wrapping this whole process up. It's been a very long process, which is good. It ought to be, and I'm even going to make mention of that here in a few minutes. I would like to offer some of my thoughts on the process as I have viewed it from the perspective of a preacher and as a member of this congregation. So first of all, I want to talk about the scrutiny that goes along with going through this process. Every one of the men that we have put before the congregation as in this process is endured a lot of scrutiny. They've had to be willing to open up their lives to a lot of questions, the lives of their families, their children, their past. Are they above reproach? What do they bring to the table as far as their skills? Are they apt to teach or able to teach? That's difficult for anybody to go through. One of the qualifications of being an elder, though, is mentioned in 1 Timothy 3, verse 1, and that is desire. It's a very good work that he desires to do. So isn't it interesting, then, that somebody would desire to go through a very uncomfortable process of scrutiny? In fact, that makes me even more impressed with the individuals that have been put before the congregation. The very fact that they would still want to be elders this deep into the process after the scrutiny that they have endured, which is all good. They ought to endure it. I'm not saying it's a negative thing, but the fact that they still want to be elders at this point says a lot about them. It's a sometimes thankless job that elders do. And yet here they are volunteering to do it. There is no financial gain. There's no pop culture status that comes along with it. They simply want to do it because it's the right thing to do for them in the way that God has designed them to serve the church. And that impresses me. The desire should be seen as the very first basis for a relationship between leadership and a congregation, between a shepherd and his flock. The very fact that he wants to serve the congregation is not only a reflection of him, but a reflection of us as well. A great question that we need to keep before ourselves as a congregation of Christians is this: Are we the kind of congregation that nurtures, that grows, that facilitates willing, zealous, excited future leaders? Or do we make it really difficult for people to want to be elders at Monte Vista? Are we the kind of congregation that people want to serve in that capacity? Or does there have to be arm twisting involved to get anybody to ever volunteer to serve as an elder here? And by the way, that doesn't just apply to people who have been set before the church now, but that applies to people who will be set before the church 5 years from now, and 10 years from now, and 20 years from now as well. Do we have people within our own congregation who are being fostered and nurtured and grown right now so that when the time comes for them to serve, they're ready to jump right in, and they do it happily and willingly and zealously, not because they feel like they have to? Remember the qualities of the Good Shepherd mentioned in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, Jesus described Himself as the Good Shepherd, and He never sees it as some kind of an obligation that He has to do. The Good Shepherd serves because He loves the sheep. And he contrasts that, by the way, with the hireling in verses 11 through 14. The hireling doesn't stick with the flock because when danger comes, he says, "They ain't my sheep." And he gets out of there as soon as he can because of the danger that's involved. But the Good Shepherd is not a hireling. He's emotionally invested in the welfare of that congregation. And the same is true from Psalm 23. As Dave Lemley read earlier in our worship service, God wants to be our shepherd. And when you read Psalm 23, you don't see any arm twisting there. That He is at our side out of love and devotion. That He is at our side through everything, through the valley of the shadow of death. That He's a protector and a disciplinarian also. But it is all motivated out of His desire to be our shepherd. You see that implied in the statements in Psalm 23. But the second point is this, and this is a larger point that's more specific to our congregation. And by the way, I want to add as a side note that if you are a visitor here today, I understand that this is going to be a lesson that's very specific to our congregation. I hope what you can take away from it at the very least, please, is that we're a group of people that love God very much and want to serve Him to the best of our ability by the standard that we see in the Word of God. And even if it's in something like selecting our leadership, we want you to walk away from Monte Vista knowing that in something like this, as in everything that we do, we want to do it by God's will and by the revelation that He's given us through His Word. Just want to throw that note in there, just in case you're a visitor here with us today. So I'm going to give some of my thoughts and some of my takeaways from the input process. The first is this, that the experience of appointing elders is one that we're not going to get to go through very many times in life. In fact, we might very rarely get to go through it. I'd be surprised, but there may or may not be someone in here even who has never gone through the process of appointing elders, where everywhere that you've lived or moved in the past, they've either already had elders in place and you moved away before any change was made, or it was a congregation that never had anybody who was qualified, so you never went through the process. So this is it's a rare treat for us as Christians. Even under the best of circumstances, you might get to go through this process a half a dozen times in your entire lifetime serving God. A half a dozen times maybe. So this is a really cool thing that we get to be involved in this, that we as a group are participating in offering input on what this church is going to look like for the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. This right now, what we're doing by appointing additional elders to our current group, this right now is determining the future of our congregation. And again, that's such a cool thing. That's such a cool thing. So make sure that you appreciate that this has been a good process also. It's been transparent. It's been drawn out in a good way so that people can have an opportunity to provide input. This is a great approach that we've gone through in selecting potential elders. In a way, this approach is the most consistent with principles that we find laid out in Titus chapter 1 and in 1 Timothy chapter 3. When you read the qualifications of elders, these aren't just like qualifications that you find at any old job. These aren't qualifications that you would have in operating heavy machinery or cleaning ducts or something. These are very subjective things, very relative things, by the way. A lot of the qualifications you can only discover by really knowing somebody, or at least knowing what their reputation is with those who have been in the congregation a lot longer than you, if you are a newer member. But these are subjective things. These are subjective things that you have to be able to ask somebody. You have to sit down and get to know a person. We don't just appoint somebody out of the blue. So I think the fact that this has been a transparent, drawn-out process of appointing elders fits the goals that you find in appointing elders in both Titus and in 1 Timothy as well. And I think also input was kept anonymous. The elders asked you as a congregation to supply the input to two who had been appointed for this task. And those two individuals, Brad and Chuck, took all that input and they removed the names from it. Got rid of the email addresses, got rid of the names, and they compiled all of the input so that our current elders, Dale and Mitch, could go through that without having any kind of a bias. So that you could feel like you could actually say what you thought, to be honest about it, to be transparent about it, to really give what you thought about something without worrying about any kind of repercussion for you personally. And I think, again, that was a really important thing. I got to see that input as well, just for total clarity, just so you know. I didn't know the names. I didn't know the email addresses as well. And I'm not part of the decision-making process, at least as Dale and Mitch are, but I wanted to make sure that you also knew, for full disclosure, that I got to see almost all of that input as well. So here are some of my other takeaways then from the input that I got to read with my own eyes, summing up, I think, a lot of your thoughts on this process. First of all, there was a full range of comments, which should be no surprise in a group of our size, but the majority, the vast majority, and I want to emphasize that without being hyperbolic or anything like that, but the vast majority of comments were incredibly positive. They were incredibly positive. And even when there was negative feedback that was offered, it was always phrased in a constructive way. It was offered in a way that was, yes, critical, but also constructive. Here's an area where I'm a little bit concerned. Here's a good question that could be asked of these men. Here's an area where I'm a little bit concerned, but this might help take care of my concern if I knew this, or if I knew a little bit more about this situation. It was always phrased in a constructive way, and I think it says a lot about you and the way that you participated in the input process. And that provides insight and gives everybody, including the potential elders and our current elders, a lot to think about here. Something to keep in mind here, even when it comes to negative feedback, go to the book of Proverbs and look at just a couple of things here. In Proverbs chapter 12, first of all here in Proverbs 12 and verse 1, we'll bounce around here in Proverbs 12 and 11. It says, "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid." Like New American Standard. That's my favorite translation of that verse, by the way. If you don't like reproof, I'm sorry. And I know we raise our kids, we don't like using the word stupid in our family. But it's in the Bible. But putting it very bluntly, if you can't take reproof, if you can't listen to a little criticism about yourself, if you're not willing to endure a little bit of scrutiny, even if you don't agree with it, if you're not willing to at least listen to what people have to say about you, you're stupid. Putting it very bluntly, you're stupid. We should expect input to become better people. That's true of elders, that's true of our children, in school, in their religious activities, in our families. That's true when we're living in sin and we need someone to come in and pull us back from the brink of spiritual chaos and self-destruction. We need to be willing to listen. And even if we're right about something, even if we disagree with the criticism, we have to be willing to listen to it. Go back to chapter 11 here and notice chapter 11, verse 14. "Where there is no guidance, the people fall, but in abundance of counselors there is victory." Now I know it's talking about counselors and taking guidance from people, but one takeaway from that is that when you do get a lot of input from a congregation, that gives an eldership a lot to work with. At first, in fact, I'll just reveal a little bit here. At first, Dale and Mitch were a little bit worried about the lack of input. It just took Chuck and Brad a little while to compile everything, and eventually they did get the totality of it, and it was quite a body, quite a volume of input. But at first they were a little worried, like, are we getting enough input here? Because if we don't get any input, well, we just won't appoint anybody. Because if you're not willing to input, if you're not willing to say anything, then maybe that means the congregation really just doesn't want any more elders. But you ended up giving a lot of input, and the volume was important. I think that Proverbs 11:14 verse says a lot there, that where there's an abundance of input, where there's an abundance of guidance, people can succeed. And go back to chapter 12 real quick and go to verse 15 now. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 15. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel. And that's true of our leaders as well. It also shouldn't surprise us that feedback was at times hard to reconcile. The way I put it is this: we have 4 men who are put before the church as potential elders. And there were comments that said, yeah, I have nothing but good things to say about man A, B, and C. Or I guess I'm using my fingers here. 1, 2, and 3. But I've got some questions about man number 4. And there were other comments that said, yeah, I love 1 and 4, but 2 and 3 are a little worrisome. And then there were other comments that said, I love number 4. I don't know about 1, 2, and 3. I might have some concerns there. It's like, well, how do you reconcile all of that then? You know, how do you put all that together? And I think Mitch put it really well when he was talking to me about this, is that we have to understand, in a group this size, you're not going to find 100% approval of everybody in every part of their life. But to emphasize, the vast majority of comments were really positive, really constructive. And the fact that these 4 men have made it this far in the process means all 4 of them are clearly above reproach. They're good men who love this congregation, who love their families, and who love the Lord. And if that wasn't the case, they wouldn't have made it this far in the process. Let's keep that in mind as well. Of course, those things are all relative terms of good comments, bad comments, and all those sorts of things. It should be pointed out that none of the candidates were regarded with anything but admiration, respect, and goodwill. There was nothing personal, there was nothing vindictive in any of the comments that were offered by the congregation. These men are all clearly above reproach. And all of the concerns that were offered, I would put them in the category of secondary issues. None of the concerns had to do with failures or serious shortcomings with any of them. They were secondary issues, which is a little bit of what I want to talk about with the second half of our lesson. Faithful children. We get to this faithful children thing, right? Anybody who's had any experience at all in the process of appointing elders knows that this whole faithful children thing from Titus 1 verse 6 has to come up eventually. So, here I am, bringing it up eventually. Keep in mind though, and I want to reiterate, keep in mind, this represents the far minority of comments that were offered about these individuals. As I present a lesson like this, I want to make sure that you understand this isn't some kind of like church dividing, half the church on one side, half on the other side. There were a few comments that questioned the qualification of faithful children. A few comments. But it was enough that it's worth our time as a church to really address it and make sure that we're all on the same page. And even if we end up a little bit in disagreement on each other, I think this is one of those questions where you see intelligent and well-meaning Christians might come to slightly different conclusions about one word of one verse out of the book of Titus. Yet we understand that there's a point behind it that we can all agree on. We can all agree on that. Let's talk about this idea of faithful children then here for a few minutes. This was, like I said, the most frequent critical feedback. And even though it was the most frequent of the critical feedback, I'm talking about this is the most frequent critical feedback of a very small amount of feedback. Most of the feedback was incredibly positive. You have a small number of negative or critical comments, and this just represents the largest portion of a small amount of comments that were offered by the congregation. According to Titus 1 verse 6, let's go ahead and open up there and read that verse together. According to Titus 1 and verse 6, a man must have faithful children, or as some translations put it, children who believe. It says here, we'll begin in verse 5 for context. For this reason I left you in Crete, that you might set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man be above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. Now, New American Standard uses the word there for believe. Other translations might say the word faithful. Something to keep in mind there as we keep going here. Go to 1 Timothy 3 and verse 4 now for a Timothy version of that same qualification, right? Because as you go through 1 Timothy and Titus, you see that the lists don't line up quite precisely here. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 4, he must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, emphasis on manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? So clearly a man must have children. That's obvious. He must have children. By the way, the Greek word for children there is an inclusive term of both the plural and the singular. In the same way that I might say, raise your hand if you have children. You were supposed to raise your hand. I was being hypothetical, I guess. Sorry about that. Raise your hand if you have children. Okay. Jason raised his hand and Dale raised his hand. But hold on a second. Dale's only got one kid. But when you speak in a term like that, where that term is inclusive of both the singular and the plural, right? Or if I say, how many of you have children? People with one child and people with multiple children are included in the category of those who have children. So by the way, that's the word that's used there of children. Children who are faithful or children who are believing. A person with one child meets that qualification. So he must have children, and his children must display some quality. But it's that quality, it's that word for faithful or believing that sometimes gets a little bit confusing. Do we mean his children must all be Christians in good standing, who attend a Church of Christ and a conservative, non-institutional Church of Christ, if we're putting together a wish list? Is that what the word means there in Titus 1 verse 6? Or is there something else meant by that word in the Greek? So let's talk about that word a little bit more closely. And I'll even put it to you this way. And by the way, this is a little bit of a betrayal to my New American Standard, which is my favorite translation. But I don't prefer the Titus 1 verse 6 translation of that word. So I'm sorry. I won't say anything like that again. On this particular point, I don't prefer the way this word has been translated. Now the word faithful or the word believing comes from the Greek word pistos. And in Titus 1 verse 6, it's piston. That must be just the way it's conjugated there. So the word pistos in the Greek, this is the Arndt, Bauer, and Gingrich lexicon definition, which is the authority on Greek definitions from the New Testament, means trustworthy, and please, this is an important point here. This is the dictionary definition of the Greek word pistos. I'm not adding any commentary. This isn't editorializing in any way. This is the Greek dictionary definition of the word pistos, which is pistos, children, in Titus 1 verse 6. Trustworthy, faithful, dependable, inspiring trust or faith. It is a character trait that is most frequently used to describe a person's trustworthiness or reliability. That is the word in Titus 1 verse 6, and why New American Standard and other translations choose to translate it believer or believe, that was their editorial decision. That was the decision by whatever board of editors went together to make that translation. Other translations do translate it to be faithful. Now, out of 68 times that the word is used in the New Testament, according to the New American Standard translation, out of 68 times that pistos or pista is used in the New Testament, it is translated faithful 26 times, responsible 18 times, sure, which is the idea of certain, right? It's a sure thing, a certain thing, 10 times, trusting 7 times, and believer or female believer only 7 times. Now that should tell you something, shouldn't it? That the vast majority of times this word is translated is not translated believer or believe. In fact, believer, just as a generic neuter term, only represents less than 10% of the times that the word is translated in the New American Standard. Less than 10% of the time. And it's always determined by context. The context clearly has to indicate that believer is what's intended there by pistos or pista. And I don't believe that the context in Titus 1 verse 6 is intended to convey the idea of believer or Christian. And why? Well, we'll get into the why here. First of all, you have contrasting traits here. Go back to Titus 1 verse 6 and let's reread that passage again. Titus 1 verse 6. And let's see the construction of the passage together now. Namely, if any man be above reproach, the husband of one wife, having, and here we get to the qualification, having children who believe, or children who are faithful, children who are pista, having children who are pista, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. Now, in our language, when we're contrasting things, contrasting opposites, we have statements that are basically this, not this statements. I'll give you a few examples here, okay? That house is large, not small. My cat is mean, not friendly. Right, Miss Bargers? All cats are mean, not friendly. There you go. That basketball player is tall, not short. And that's the sentence used in Titus 1 verse 6. Having children who are this, not this. Having children who are pista, not rebellious or accused of dissipation. Dissipation simply being a word that describes somebody who's self-indulgent, wasteful, has no self-control. Okay? Now, would this sentence make any sense, though? That house is large, not stucco. That basketball player is tall, not hairy. See, those sentences don't work, because when you create a this, not this statement, you are contrasting things that are related but opposite to each other. A house that's large, not small. A basketball player that's tall, not short. Not a basketball player who's tall, not hairy. Those things are unrelated to each other. The way the sentence is built, you're not contrasting things that have any relation to each other. Now, here's the point I'm getting at. In Titus 1 verse 6, however you're going to interpret pista in Titus 1 verse 6, whatever that means, reliable, trustworthy, faithful, believing, however you're going to interpret that has to be the opposite of rebellious or given to dissipation. Because we know rebellious and given to dissipation. There's no question, I think, about the translation of those things. It's a this, not this statement. So whatever pista is the opposite of rebellious or given to dissipation. Now, while it can be very truly stated that a Christian is not to be rebellious or given to dissipation, if you were creating a this, not this statement, Christian and rebellious and given to dissipation are not opposites. Christian and non-Christian are opposites. Believer and non-believer are opposites, as even Jesus Himself said in John 20 verse 27 when He's talking to Thomas there. He says, be not unbelieving, but believing. So even if Jesus wants to contrast believers and non-believers, He uses believer and non-believer. Christian is not the opposite of rebellious and not given to dissipation. But you know what is? Faithful, trustworthy, reliable. Those things are the opposite of rebellious and given to dissipation. Those are the opposite. I simply don't believe that believer or Christian is the opposite of whatever Titus 1 verse 6 is presenting as being the negative that you might find in an elder's children. Not only that, but when you look at the lists in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1, you see, if you believe that believer is what's being intended there, that an elder's children must be Christians in good standing in every one of them, if you take that, then why didn't he tell Timothy to inform the Ephesian congregation of the same thing? In the age before email and telephone, and in an age before the Ephesian church and the Cretan church even had the ability to have completed New Testaments, where they could just go, all right, let's compare 1 Timothy 3 to Titus 1. They didn't have a volume of New Testament letters at their disposal for easy page-turning reference. So why would Timothy present a list to Ephesus that simply says, one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control? But then Titus goes to Crete with another list that says, but his children must be Christians in good standing, if that's what pista means there. Those are not the same qualification. But if Titus was supposed to go to Crete with the information of, yes, an elder's children must be faithful, reliable, trustworthy, they must be pista, that's basically the same thing as saying he must manage his household well and keep his children under control. His children can't be rebellious. His children can't be wasteful. They can't be self-indulgent. They can't be disrespectful. Suddenly, if you interpret pistol to mean faithful or trustworthy in Titus 1 verse 6, rather than believer in Titus 1 verse 6, there's no issue anymore between these lists. The standard remains the same, and the conflict suddenly disappears. As long as a man has children who are respectful, trustworthy, and under control, especially while living under his roof, that man meets the qualifications of both Titus and 1 Timothy. And the reason I put it that way is this. We tend to insert our own additional qualifications when we talk about elders, which is the whole point of the apple thing, okay? In case you hadn't gotten it already. We come to the elder selection process with a lot of desire for what we want an elder to be, and that's fine. That's nothing wrong with that. We expect a lot about in fact, we expect the most out of our elders. They should be the cream that rises to the top as far as those who are willing to serve, those who are willing to sacrifice, those who are willing to be an example, those who are willing to do the really hard, dirty jobs that are so difficult that a lot of us are either incapable or unwilling to do. We should expect that from them. But let's not expect anything more from them than what Timothy and Titus presented to Ephesus and Crete. Let's not expect anything more of them than what is expected biblically. So we come up with all these hypothetical situations, and this is my personal commentary, by the way. I'm just letting you know. We come up with all these hypothetical situations of, well, what if a man has 5 kids, and one of them did this, and the other 3 did this, or what if a man's got this, or what if his kids aren't old enough, and what if his kids are too old, and we come up with kind of all these hypothetical situations and scenarios to try and build this man in our mind that I don't think any real human being actually fits. So let's go back to the Bible, which is my whole goal. That's it. I don't have any kind of like claim here or a stake in this or anything. Let's read what's on the page. And what's on the page can be summed up if you want to take 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 and put them together. A man must have children. He needs to know how to manage those children as long as they're in his household. As long as they live under his roof, they must be kept under control with all dignity. And those children must display the quality of being faithful, trustworthy, reliable, dependable. I think it goes beyond the intention of the text and beyond the context of Titus 1 verse 6 to say anything more than that. That they must be a certain age, that they must act some way that's not described there in the text, that they must be Christians and every single one of them in good standing at a certain kind of, at a Church of Christ that we've kind of built a lot of things around what the text actually says rather than just sticking to what it says, just plain and simple. Now, I know we're running out of time, so we'll go ahead and speed things up here. So just to clarify, the reaction that some people might have to this, which I don't think it's really the majority considering the fact that the comments along these lines were really a minuscule number of comments. But again, it was enough that I felt like it was time to address it, make sure we all understood we were, on the same page here. But the question might come along as, so do an elder's children not need to be Christians then? I mean, is that just a non-factor? And my response to that is this, that if a man does manage his own household well, and if he does teach them the gospel, as every single one of us ought to be teaching our children the gospel, then you would expect to see qualities like faithfulness displayed in a man's children's lives. You would expect to see that. You would expect to see that. And as long as they're living under his household, you would expect to see that they are obedient to their father and that they're doing what they should be doing religiously. As long as they're under his household, he is managing his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. But our children grow up. And we can be the very best teachers, and we can do everything we can for them and follow everything that God asks us to do in raising our children. But they grow up, and they're going to make their own choices. They'll make their own decisions. And a man cannot be held responsible for what his adult children do. With that being said, though, with that being said, we should expect to see the same qualities and characteristics that were instilled in them from a very early age continue on through life, which is why I come to the conclusion that while every one of an elder's children doesn't need to be a Christian, every one of an elder's children still needs to be faithful in some way. They need to be trustworthy. They need to be reliable. They need to display the character quality of faithfulness. So even if an elder's child grows up and decides not to go to church anymore, is that person still trustworthy? Are they still law-abiding? Do they still display the qualities of being raised in a godly environment by the man who's leading this congregation and shepherding this flock? We should still see that. We should still see that. Key questions then. And this is the last point. Can we see that a man's children are pistol, faithful, trustworthy, reliable? Can we see that a man's children are faithful when they're a little bit on the young side? Well, certainly. Are they obedient? Are they respectful and well-behaved? How do they handle responsibilities that are appropriate to their age? As far as one can be faithful at a given age, is that child faithful at that given age? What you would expect from someone who is 12, 16, 18, 20, 30, are they faithful for their given age? Can we see that a man's adult children are still faithful even if one of them is not a Christian? And again, yes. Is that child still trustworthy in spite of the spiritual decisions that were made after moving away from his father's household? Is that person law-abiding? Is that person reliable? And while we hope that our children, our adult children, stay the course spiritually, they still show by their character what kind of an upbringing that they've had. And can you still see that quality even as an elder's children grow up and move out and make their own decisions? And how has personal experience with a child, either young, old, believing, or not believing, how has personal experience with a child impacted that potential elder? What are the positives? What are the negatives? What are the lessons that could be learned along the way? How has that experience shaped this person? Let's trust the process. If there are concerns, and there are only a few, I know I keep making that point, but I just want to make sure, let's not dramatize it or be hyperbolic about this or anything. If there are concerns, though, the last step of the process is to meet with our current elders, and they're going to ask some really tough questions. I promise you that. They're going to ask some really tough questions. If these four guys think that they've gotten through the hard part now, it's not over. It's not over yet. And the comments and concerns and questions that you have will be addressed in private meetings with the four men who have been put before this congregation. Let's trust the process. Let's trust that we've spent several months now talking to people, digging into their lives, putting them through scrutiny. They've endured all of it, that they've read the Scriptures, that they've prayed intently, that they've pondered it and meditated this. Let's trust this process. So maybe you like yellow apples more than red apples. You might prefer one or the other, or you might wish that one had some quality that the other one didn't. You might say, I'd like to see a little more sweetness out of those sour apples. Or I'd like to see a little more yellow in that red delicious. But at the end of the day, when you take personal preference out of it, an apple is still an apple. And if a man is qualified to be an elder by the Scriptures, even if you personally might have one issue with one qualification out of the totality of a man's life, the mosaic of who he is, a man who's qualified to be an elder by the Scriptures is qualified to be an elder. And we've got to come together as a congregation. We've got to unite under the leadership that God has designed in the Scriptures and work and keep moving forward. This is a growing church with so much going on that is positive and exciting. We love God, we love His Word, we love the lost, and we want to keep preaching and teaching the best that we can. Good leadership helps make all of that possible. So let's keep going. And when the decision is finally made at the end of all of it, let us love our elders the way that we love the Good Shepherd. Let us cling to them and trust them and embrace them and obey them. I love you guys very much. God loves you. Our elders love you. And if you're not a Christian here this morning, or if you're a Christian who's been struggling spiritually, you have an opportunity right now to set things right with God. Make whatever spiritual need you have known at this time by coming forward as we stand and sing.